This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston, bringing you stories of capitalism. With all the talk about housing affordability, is there anything we can do to make houses cheaper instead of just helping people pay more? Our new contributor, Christopher Freeland, travels to Sweden to see how it works when we manufacture houses instead of building them. And we all make mistakes, whether we like to admit them or not. Two people well known to Wall Street, Josh Steiner and Michael Lynton, have come clean about their big, embarrassing mistakes. One at Sony Pictures, the other at the Treasury Department. In their new book, From Mistakes to Meaning, they show us why learning from our mistakes is both harder and more important than we thought. But we start with that big story of a duel between the Supreme Court and President Trump.
In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. They're all coming in over the next week. We're making deals with all of them. And I said, if we don't make a deal, then we're going to tariff them an extra 5, 6, 7, 8%, whatever the difference is, and we'll take it that way. The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing. And I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
That played out this week when the president gave his State of the Union address with the members of the court right up front. Jason Furman of Harvard takes us through the ramifications of the conflict for the economy and what likely comes next. So, Jason, we heard from President Trump this week in the State of the Union address, and he sort of gave us State of the Economic Union. And among other things, he said, we have plunging inflation, we have rapidly rising incomes, and the economy's roaring like it's never roared before. Is he right?
To a first approximation, the year since Donald Trump became president, economically was very similar to the year before he was president. It's actually been a perfectly good year. It's not the horror that Democrats might have predicted, but it's certainly not any sort of turning point that Donald Trump was trying to brag about either.
As an economist looking at the U.S. economy right now, what are the strong points?
We've had steady growth. It continued in 2025 at the same pace it was in 2024, which was a pretty good pace. There's some tentative signs that maybe productivity growth is picking up a little. It's only a smidge, but hopefully it's a hint of what's to come. The unemployment rate has basically stabilized.
How much of that good news in the economy do you think is because of AI, both the investment in AI and the promise of AI?
I think some of it is. AI was a big factor on the demand side in the economy in 2025. It could be an even bigger factor in 2026. That's all the money that's spent building data centers, the energy to supply them, and the like. We're only just starting to see the first hints of AI showing up on the supply side of the economy. Productivity growth in 2025 looks like it'll be maybe a little bit above the pace we had in the previous cycle, but only a little bit above. So, early days on supply, but a lot of demand.
When it comes to tariffs, President Trump, in his remarks, made it clear he's sticking with tariffs. Whatever the Supreme Court sitting right in front of him thinks about tariffs, he's going to go ahead with them. What has that really done to the economy? Has it had a lot of effect?
I think it has subtracted a bit from growth and added a meaningful amount to inflation. The inflation one is easier to prove. You can just look through the different types of goods and furniture, consumer electronics, and you see those prices rising, and normally you would have expected them to be stable at a time like this. So it really is showing up. Is it a dramatic recession or an apocalypse? Definitely not. In fact, the models never predicted that you would have something that dramatic, but that doesn't mean that we should be blasé about what might be tens of billions of dollars of damage to the economy.
Business leaders often talk about uncertainty and how that is really a dampener on growth for them. Whatever the tariff rate is, tell me what it is and I'll deal with it, as opposed to I'm not sure. There's been a lot of uncertainty, both in the way the tariffs were imposed and now with the Supreme Court decision. Can you approximate what that might mean for the economy? Is it having an effect on the economy?
Probably. It leads to some delay of investment, some desire to do things overseas rather than in the United States. The Supreme Court decision, I think, ultimately will give us more certainty. because the IEEPA tariffs that the president had been doing before, he'd been constantly changing them at a drop of a hat. He didn't like the tone of voice, didn't like a television ad in another country, tariffs go up. The new authorities that he's still going to have, like Section 301, take more time and effort. They're hard to change them on a dime. And so if he wants to have high tariffs, we're going to have high tariffs. He can't quite change them on a whim in the way he was doing before under the new legal regime.
Over and above the direct effect on trade from tariffs, there are also these agreements that the Trump administration has been entering into or trying to enter into, and they involve investment in the United States and other sort of concessions. How much could they help the economy, or in their absence hurt the economy?
Most of those agreements are relatively minor. They're repackaging stuff that probably already would have happened anyway. Or maybe you get more investment coming from Japan or Korea in one form, but then they buy fewer treasuries and you get less investment in some other form, and it all washes out on the other end. So I don't see very much upside for the U.S. economy from those agreements. In his State of the Union address, President Trump suggested once again that maybe tariffs could replace income tax. How feasible is that? That's ludicrous. Income tax collects over $10 trillion over the next decade, and the tariffs are in the hundreds of billions per year. There's no comparison between them. Even if the tariffs cannot replace income tax, it is money coming into the Treasury at a time that goodness knows the United States could use money coming into the Treasury. No matter who gets to be president, do you think we can ever take these tariffs back off from a fiscal side? The one respect in which tariffs are working is they are raising revenue. It's just that there are so many other ways to raise revenue that would be less harmful to the U.S. economy. So I would much rather we not frame the discussion around do we want tariffs or nothing. I'd rather the conversation be do we want tariffs or do we find another way to replace that revenue, maybe also do some spending cuts that's much more economically sensible.
The Supreme Court struck down President Trump's tariffs, something the president called unfortunate. But the justices left it to the lower courts to decide on appropriate remedies. Before the decision, we went over the options with Jennifer Hillman, a senior fellow for trade and international political economy at the Council on Foreign Relations.
So if the court rules that the tariffs were illegal from the get-go, then the tariffs must be refunded to those that have paid them. And if we look, to date through at least the end of August, that means about $88 to $100 billion worth of tariffs would need to be refunded to the importers that paid those tariffs in the first instance. Because if they're unlawful, then everyone is entitled to a refund with interest.
Is there a mechanism for doing that? That sounds like an enormous undertaking.
There is a mechanism, but you are correct, it is an enormous undertaking. And it basically splits out into whether or not the particular import of this particular item in this particular shipment, whether or not all of the paperwork that Customs has to do about those has closed or not. In Customs parlance, we say the entries have been liquidated. So for all of the entries that have not yet closed out, everyone can go back in and say, I made a mistake, in essence, on my import declaration. I don't owe any tariffs under IEEPA. I'm going to change my declaration, and I don't owe any of these tariffs, and you owe me a refund. For all of the entries that have already closed out, then there is a 180-day period in which you can file effectively a protest that in essence says to the Customs Service, you overcharged me, and you owe me a refund. But again, the Trump administration could make this a very easy, straightforward process. Everybody that applies automatically gets their refunds. Or they can make it a very difficult process. If they want to challenge each and every entry, if they want to say, you need to provide more information, you haven't given us everything that we need, they could make this a very difficult process. And again, for the big importers that have all of the paperwork readily available, they are likely to, again, go ahead and move to process all of their refunds. It's going to be those small businesses, and they're the ones that have been hurting the most from these tariffs. They're going to have the most difficulty if this process is difficult. They don't know exactly what paperwork to file. if the Trump administration were decide to try to fight all of this and make everyone challenge in individual lawsuits, the question will come whether all these small businesses, do they have enough money to pay the legal fees? Do they know how to go through the process? And whether or not, again, this is going to be a requirement that you have to do this entry by entry, or whether there's going to be a much broader ability to process refunds at more, again, on a group and on a sort of nationwide basis. So again, it's going to depend. But as a matter of law, if the tariffs are illegal, refunds should be paid.
Up next, coming to terms with our most embarrassing mistakes. In a new book, authors Michael Lynton and Josh Steiner come clean and teach us something about how we can truly learn from those mistakes we'd rather forget. This is a story about not letting bygones be bygones. We like to say that we can learn from our mistakes, but when it's a big, truly embarrassing mistake, we sometimes do everything we can not to revisit it. Now, two names well known to Wall Street have decided to write a book unpacking what went wrong for them and why. For Michael Lynton, when he ran Sony Pictures, and for Josh Steiner, when he was Chief of Staff to the Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration. Their book is From Mistakes to Meaning, Owning Your Past so it doesn't own you. Words matter, and it's mistakes to meaning, not failures to meaning. That's an important distinction for you.
Yeah, it's a really important point for us. There have been great books written about success and about failure, and we think of success and failure as siblings. In both cases, you have a group of people, they come together, they're trying to do something meaningful, they have a plan to do it. In one case, it turns out well, in the other case, it doesn't. But they're both intentional. One way to think about it, at least the way we thought about it, was there's a reason we say marriages fail, and that if you get married at 3 a.m. in Vegas after a couple of cocktails, that's a mistake. In the case of marriage, people come together, they want to do something meaningful, it doesn't work out, so it failed. But mistakes are something that you do without self-awareness, without understanding the context in which you're operating, and that you end up regretting.
And the other thing is that maybe with the exception of marriage, not that many people have the opportunity to have failures. It does require a pretty substantial or significant decision to be made. Mistakes, everybody makes them, and they make them all day long. So we knew that it was fertile ground.
And the surprising part is no one talks about them. As soon as we go on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, we're going to find 18 books on the subject. And we couldn't find one good book about the concept of mistakes. We found a gazillion books about success, lots of books about failure, and not one about mistakes.
Was there a magic moment for this book between the two of you?
There was. It involved a walk on the beach and Josh coming up with this idea. Josh could probably tell the story the best because he was the one who actually thought of the idea in the first place.
Both of us had a mistake that we'd been living with and had never spoken about. And in my case, I had suppressed it ineffectually for many, many years.
When you came up with the idea and said to me, we should write a book about mistakes, it really landed because I myself had been living with something for a long time that I really did not want to address.
Michael has this nice saying about mistakes are windows into ourselves.
And that's where Alison Papadakis came into the picture. Papadakis is a professor of psychology who studies stress and coping at Johns Hopkins University.
So Josh and Michael started off with wanting to look at mistakes, and they really started off more on their own with it, and then they realized that they wanted a little bit more input, so they brought me in. But a lot of what came across in the book is their own ideas about things, and then they were sort of wanting to check it out. Does this really align with the psychological literature and research? And that's where I came, is try to help them to see this really does actually make sense, and it's not bunk. You guys are coming up with good ideas. And then around their stories, I helped them to just go a little bit deeper, and then started to recognize patterns in their lives over time that got reflected.
Everybody has a lot of mistakes. I had a few myself, most of them having to do with my professional career, and I wrote up one or two before that. And then I realized I was avoiding the main event, which was, the cyber attack that happened to Sony 10 years ago, and that there was a mistake at the core that caused the events that led ultimately to the cyber attack.
The FBI is investigating that destructive cyber attack at Sony Pictures.
This is costing Sony hundreds of millions of dollars. 10 minutes ago now, the FBI announced it's formally accusing North Korea of hacking Sony Pictures.
So at the core, what do you look back and think was your mistake involved in the Sony situation?
At the core, it was agreeing to make the movie The Interview.
You want us to kill the leader of North Korea?
Yes.
What?
And in retrospect, it was definitely a bad decision, and it was definitely one that put the company in jeopardy.
You talk about 3 acts
Right.
to the mistakes. There's the prelude, what led up to it, there's the mistake itself, and then there's the postlude. You describe in the book, you had put in place a rigorous process for greenlighting movies.
Yeah, we had a very, very strong process that had been in place for many years before that. We didn't suddenly get emotionally connected to an idea or a project and say, let's go. But as opposed to that, you get people around the table all from different disciplines, and they give their voice to whether, the marketing folks telling you whether it's a good idea, the production folks. That was not the case when I agreed to make The Interview.
Which leads to the question, why? Why on that one?
I had been in the job for a while, over a decade, and I was typically the person in the room who was Mr. No. I was actually the guy in the suit. Everybody else around the table, for the most part, were people who were either directly creative executives or interacting a lot with creative executives. And I was the person who was expected to be the adult in the room. There was a moment where I really did not want to play that role. I really wanted to be on the other side of the table, so to speak, with the creative community. And in that moment, I said, okay, let's go, let's make this movie, and threw all of those careful processes out the window.
I think it took us a while in Michael's case to figure out what the 3 acts were. And the first act for Michael was actually your childhood.
I'd grown up in Westchester, I'd grown up in Scarsdale, and I was upended in the late 60s and moved to Holland. And my parents themselves were immigrants, so they weren't very sympathetic to my sister and my situation. We were very lonely, and that existed for a number of years, and it had a big effect on me. And I think Josh is right. That's ultimately what played a part in my decision to do this.
In Act 2, one of the things that struck me in reading the book about what happened in that room at the table reading was the hydraulic pressure.
Yeah, so what the circumstances were was everybody at that point really wanted to make that movie. We'd had great success with Seth Rogen comedies in the past. It read funny on the page. Everybody wanted to do it. And there was an added circumstance, which was there was a competitive studio, Universal, which also had a relationship with Seth Rogen, and they wanted to make the movie. So it had all come down to this moment to make that decision. And I sat there, and you're right, the entire room was raring to go, and I got caught up in the moment. By the time the read-through was finished, everybody was high-fiving, clapping. It was hilarious. There were things in the script I should have been paying attention to, not least of which that we assassinated the leader of a hostile nation, Kim Jong-un. But in that moment, I was so caught up in it. I so wanted to shed my suit, so to speak, and be part of the gang that I said, sure, let's go.
So you made your mistake, greenlighting it, it went into production, went along, and at some point you basically lost your computer system and even lost the information in it, which could be misused. Give us a sense of how large those consequences were in your world.
So we say yes, the thing goes into production, and then at the June of that year we put out a trailer to say the movie's coming in the Christmas season. And at that point, the North Korean government, through the envoy in New York, sort of sent us a warning that something bad could happen. We checked with the State Department, we checked with the Rand Corporation. No, these guys are all bark, no bite, don't worry about it, nothing can ever happen. As it turns out, they were referring to Kim Jong-il, not Kim Jong-un. He was new on the scene, they didn't really understand what he was capable of. We're now in the fall, and all of a sudden, I'm driving to work, and I get a panicked call from my CFO, Dave Hendler, and he says, everything is down. All of our systems are fried. And when I finally got to the studio and we started looking at it, 70% of our laptops were knocked out. In the weeks following, this is all well known, the emails started coming out. It was like ground zero for the news. Everybody was looking at Sony. By the way, nobody was helpful. Everybody else ran for the hills because all of these emails started coming out. And by the way, movies started coming out. Up on our systems, we had The Karate Kid. That suddenly was available for people to watch online, all because our systems got hacked. Plus, we couldn't operate the studio for at least a week because there was no way of moving material around.
So you had the distinction of having the President of the United States call you out on your mistake.
I was going on Fareed Zakaria's show to try and explain what was happening at that moment at the studio. It was sort of, we were a quarter way through the whole series of events. And at that point, they had not yet identified with absolute certainty that it was the North Koreans who had done it. So just before I went on the show, Fareed Zakaria said to me, oh, the president, they've just announced that it was the North Koreans and the president is going to do a quick press conference.
Hello, everybody.
The president was taking some questions from reporters, and the reporter said, A, what are you going to do about the North Koreans? And B, what do you think of what Sony has done?
Sony suffered significant damage. There were threats against its employees. I am sympathetic to the concerns that they faced. Having said all that, yes, I think they made a mistake.
What he didn't fully comprehend, and which I sort of laid out in the interview with Fareed Zakaria, was that it wasn't our decision at that point because the theaters had declined to show the movie. Streaming didn't exist in that moment, so we had no way of getting the movie out. So in a funny way, the president misunderstood what we were trying to do, and that in of itself was a mistake. Having said that, he, in a very gracious act, about 10 days later, called me, apologizing for saying what he said, which was not necessary. But secondly, he did say, but what were you thinking making a movie where you assassinate the leader of a hostile nation? Like, surely that was a mistake. And on reflection, and in that moment, I suddenly realized he's right. He identified the mistake, and that was actually a mistake.
Would it have been different if you'd had all the time in the world to think it through, to talk to Josh about it? Would it have come out differently?
I think my life would have been different, yes. I think had I, at an earlier moment, reflected on it, understood what the root cause was, understood really how I felt about it emotionally, I would have been able to keep my head upright in a much better way than I did. Instead, what I wound up doing was, the minute it was behind me, I really never wanted to look at it again. I really took the attitude, okay, that's over. Let's not reflect on it. Let's not consider why I did that in the first place. Let's just move forward. And I can honestly say that in and of itself was a mistake. I imagined for a long time that every time I walked, years after the event, that every time I walked in the room of any event, a dinner, a party, just a group of people, my own family, what they see on my forehead is Sony hack. That's what I imagined. When, of course, for 99% of the population, it was completely in their rearview mirror. It never came to their mind.
And this is an example of where Allison was super helpful, because Allison educated us about something called the spotlight effect.
I mean, many of the mistakes in the book were public ones, so of course it's going to happen more in those kinds of situations. But even for people who aren't making public mistakes or talking about them in a public sort of way, it still happens on a day-to-day basis. We worry that our colleagues, our friends, our family, that they're thinking about these things when in fact usually it's just us.
Is there ever a time that it actually may be healthier simply to move on rather than to dwell on your mistakes?
I think for some people with some mistakes, if it's a minor thing or if they actually have a pretty good understanding of it, then it's easier to do that and just move on. But if it's something like the kinds of mistakes that are in the book where it really was very meaningful to folks, it really was a watershed moment in their lives, I think you can't really move on until you really do get an understanding of it. And for most folks, it takes pausing and unpacking it a bit to really get to that level of understanding to be able to move on.
Next, we turn to Josh Steiner's mistake, one very different from the one Michael Lynton had made, and what we can all learn from it.
This isn't like the World Series, where people are like, oh, great, I went to the World Series twice. Once is plenty. You don't need to do it twice, trust me.
All of us make our share of mistakes, but not all of us are in the public eye the way that Michael Lynton was when he ran Sony Pictures and incurred the wrath of the North Korean regime, or the way that Josh Steiner was when he was in the Clinton Treasury Department and got wrapped up in the Whitewater investigation. Take us through your mistake in Washington.
At the age of 27, I became the chief of staff at the Treasury Department. In the 1990s, the beginning part of the Clinton administration was a little bit fraught with scandals, the most notable of which was the Whitewater investigation. And like many senior officials, I got subpoenaed. I actually turned over all the documents that were relevant, one of which, unfortunately, was my personal diary. And in that personal diary, I had written things about Whitewater. And keeping a personal diary in Washington is not necessarily a mistake. Writing about sensitive investigations in your diary, that's a mistake. And it was a big one.
So again, it's important to identify exactly what the mistake is. It was not keeping the diary, in your view, looking back on it now.
Yeah, I was a history major. I have a graduate degree in history. You couldn't write history if people who had been involved in public policy and government didn't keep diaries. That's not a mistake. But they were experienced enough, wise enough, mature enough to know that you're not supposed to write things about investigations because there was an independent counsel involved, and my diary include references to sensitive conversations. And worse still, it was the worst combination of a personal diary, therefore not particularly accurate, and about things which were highly sensitive. That's a pretty toxic combination.
I made no effort to check the accuracy of my diary because this was never intended to be a precise narrative or a verbatim account of what took place. It was, more than anything, a way to reflect on events and draw lessons from my personal and professional experiences. I wish that my diary was more accurate.
What's your Act One look like? What led you to that decision?
One of the things that we discovered about mistakes was you really need to understand the context in which you're operating. And I had started to keep a diary when I was traveling through Asia at the age of 23, and it was totally appropriate. You're in Bali, you're in Malaysia, and you're writing down your notes, probably a little bit of terrible poetry. You meet someone and you're keeping a recollection of the person you met. That's appropriate in that context. I then had a series of jobs, ultimately at Treasury. It was fine to keep a diary, but it would be better if I kept a diary that was appropriate for Washington, not backpacking through Asia. And that contextual question keeps coming up over and over again. Like, know your context, apply the right rules and processes and systems, decision-making skills to the context in which you're operating.
One of the things I admire, but maybe was a little surprised at, doesn't appear you ever thought about just not giving them the diary.
Yeah, I received a fair amount of criticism at the time for being naive enough to think that I needed to turn it over. And my view was that the subpoena was very clear and the law is the law. And I really, really regretted writing what I did in my diary. I have no regret about complying with the subpoena.
So what was the price you paid, personally or within the larger context? In the Clinton administration, you were still working in the Clinton administration, right?
Yeah. First of all, Secretary Benson was unbelievably gracious to me. I tendered my resignation, and he said no. He said, no, you're doing a good job. This wasn't so awesome. That was a little bit of an understatement. And he said, nevertheless, you got to keep going. So the price I paid was certainly I lost some credibility with my colleagues, appropriately enough. I had made some bad decisions, and I think they questioned my judgment over it, and that was appropriate. The bigger price was I'd lost some self-confidence and sense of self. And I thought of myself as someone who had good judgment, who was able to operate at a senior level within the government. And I questioned whether this was evidence of the fact that I was in fact too young for my job. There's no question I carried with me embarrassment and shame as a result of what happened.
Again, if you had the time to reflect on it, the 3 acts at the time, would you have done anything differently?
Yes. I think in hindsight, I tried to massage it too much. And I shouldn't have been as concerned about whether it all lined up perfectly, and just should have said, look, I wrote what I wrote, you can interpret it the way you want to interpret it.
There are a number of other chapters in this book with different people, some of whom we all know very well, some we may not know quite as well. What were the ones that either surprised you or stood out for you, Michael?
Malcolm Gladwell. So if I were to tell you that Malcolm Gladwell considers it to have been a mistake that he decided to become a writer, that was the professional path that he chose, given his success, I dare say you'd be surprised.
Every person we asked had a mistake that they'd been carrying with them for a long period of time, that they were eager to get off their chest. And they were very moving. Some of them related to family dynamics, some of them related, as Michael said, to career choices. And their willingness to talk was very generous.
Having gone through this process, unpeeled the onion, as you describe it, does it make you better at what you do today?
You'd have to ask Michael what he does today first. It's not obvious to me.
It's not clear to me either, frankly, so I wouldn't answer it that way. Yeah, I think it does. I think, one of the ideas in the book is something called a cheetah pause, which means that before you react to something, you take a breath and you actually try and understand what your emotional state is and what your real thinking is before you actually commit yourself to that action.
I spent a lot of my career in the investing community, and you grew up in the investing community, and you always think about the balance between fear and greed. Which is it? You think to yourself, every position size is either too big or too small. The work that we did on this book helped me understand that a lot of things in life are sort of like this. It's approach avoidance. It's both. We're really attracted to something and we're really scared about something. And one of the ways to make fewer mistakes, and I think one of the things that we discovered, is a willingness to recognize that both can be true. You're attracted to it, you're afraid of it, and how do you balance fear and greed? It's not all one or the other. It's finding that path.
There's the making a decision in the moment, right? And I think sometimes we get overwhelmed by emotion, or we get so focused in on the rational decision making that we forget to kind of take a step back.
Johns Hopkins psychology professor Alison Papadakis says one tried and true way to avoid mistakes is taking a pause before a plunge.
So there's a great example in the book with Irv Gotti, who is a music producer who really blew up his relationship with J-Lo by allowing his emotion in one situation to move over into another one. Had he, for totally legitimate reasons, he had a lot of emotion response to the situation, but had he been able to take a moment and not answer the phone that then led to this major mistake that he made, I think he might have made a different decision in it. And it's that kind of allowing yourself the time, the space to do it. Now, not all decisions allow that, right? But if we can do what's called a cheetah pause, right? So cheetahs run incredibly fast, but they can also decelerate and stop very quickly too. So if we've got the cheetah running, right? Or the train going, right? We've got to make a decision. If we can figure out how to make a little pause in there to allow ourselves to use our wise minds, right? To make these rational decisions that include both emotion and our rationality, that can be very helpful.
One thing that I've had in my mind for a long time, which is if you're not making some mistakes, you're not trying enough risky things. But is the real lesson here, it's not a question of taking the risk, it's how you take the risk.
I think our book is less about not taking the risk or taking the risk per se. One way to think about it, to your point, is if you're a loan officer and you're so risk adverse, you never make a loan, you're unlikely to be a successful loan officer. And if you approve every loan, you're unlikely to be successful. Our book is slightly different, which is loan officers are going to make bad loans. Investors are going to make bad decisions. If the inclination of that loan officer and that investor is to hide that mistake, to not talk about the mistake, they're making a whole new mistake. And the real premise of our book is acknowledgement that we all are going to make mistakes and that it's a natural part of life, and that the way to make fewer of them and to carry less shame, less guilt, less regret is just to talk about them.
This is a lot of work you've gone through with Alison. If it works perfectly, 100%, what does the reader take away? What have you accomplished?
What did you take away?
Well, I have my own mistake.
Okay, let's hear it.
When I was president of ABC News, we had Leonardo DiCaprio front an Earth Day special for us because he was the chair of the organization at that time. And it was a decision I made on the spur of the moment. I was relatively new in the job. I wanted acceptance from the journalists. I was trying to do something I thought was noble. It was environmental. And my team decided to have him go into the White House and interview President Clinton, and I got killed. I mean, it was brutal. And it built up to President Clinton at a big black tie dinner with 1,000 people in Washington getting up and doing the whole talk about me.
But I just want to say this to David Weston. You know, I've been in a lot of tough spots. Don't let this get you down. You may not be America's news leader, but you're king of the world.
Have you talked about that on television before?
No, I've never heard this. First time.
Well, so this is the hope.
I've talked about it.
Okay, this is really
wife.
the hope. No, but this is exactly the hope, that someone who's been super successful across a whole stage of different careers, seriously, as a lawyer, as an executive, as someone who's done really interesting television, this book hopefully has given you permission for the first time to talk about something publicly, which had stayed with you for a long time. And that's our aspiration, that more people have that sense that it's okay, that you don't just have to talk about the success, you don't have to suppress the mistake, that it's okay to go public.
I don't think what people should take away from this is by reading this book, you're never going to make another mistake. That is naive, and that's actually not what we're hoping for. Will you reduce the number of mistakes you make? Maybe. Hopefully. Will you understand better why you made those mistakes and perhaps over time make fewer? Probably. In fact, I think most likely. And equally importantly, and this is the big fact, that after you've made that mistake, and by examining that mistake, you can get rid of the shame. You don't have to live with that burden the way that I lived with it, the way that Josh lived with it, the way that lots of people live with it all the time. By actually trying to examine why you did it, to understand what your emotional state was, you can live with yourself in a better way. And that, to me, would be 100% success.
Up next, getting the cost of housing down. We travel to Sweden to see how manufacturing a house, rather than building it, may be part of the answer. Home ownership has long been a key part of the American dream, but today it's further out of reach than it's been in decades. Our new contributor, Chrystia Freeland, former finance minister and deputy prime minister of Canada, has firsthand experience with this from her time in government, where her party promised to expand prefab housing. She travels to Sweden to take a closer look at how homes are built and how rethinking that process could mean less expensive houses rather than helping people pay higher and higher prices.
In the far north of Sweden, the marvels of modern manufacturing are on full display.
This looks more like a factory than a housing site.
I hope so. Otherwise, we would have been failing.
Here at Lindbäcks, 500 miles north of Stockholm, houses aren't built piece by piece. They roll off an assembly line. The company produces roughly 40 units a week, a rarity in an industry known for drawn-out timelines. In Sweden, nearly half of single-family homes and about 20% of all residential buildings are built this way.
International visitors, when they come to talk to you, what do they say about their own situation? Mm-hmm. What brings them here?
They say the price is too high. It's too costly to buy a home, to rent an apartment, and they come to us to see if our way of doing it is the solution or part of the solution.
Housing affordability. It's a growing concern that unites Americans on both sides of the aisle.
America will not become a nation of renters. We're not going to do that.
You don't have to be in Congress to understand how badly we need to bring down the cost of housing.
And people on both sides of the Atlantic.
This is more than a housing crisis. This is a social crisis.
Apollo's Housing Affordability Index shows that buying a home in the United States hasn't been this difficult since the 1980s. Over the past decade alone, home prices have doubled, and those who can afford to buy are significantly older. In 2010, the median age of all U.S. homebuyers was 39. Today, it's 59. The median age of a first-time homebuyer has also climbed to 40. It's a dynamic that Beata Caranci, chief economist at TD Bank Group, has spent much of her career analyzing.
Housing, a huge preoccupation. How important is it?
It's important on a couple of levels. It's a large share of the economy in terms of workers it employs, in terms of output. So it's a large contributor. And then it's important because it's probably the most important thing people think about when they think about affordability, lifestyle, ability to pay for rent or home ownership. So I know myself, when I'm out speaking with our clients, I think it's like the second or third question that comes up is about whether their children will be able to afford a home and what that outlook looks like.
When it comes to housing affordability, the issue comes down to a familiar equation: supply versus demand. Purchasing power on one side, production constraints on the other.
You have pointed to astonishing lack of productivity in the construction sector. What's going on there?
Yeah, it's beyond lack of productivity. It's regressing. What we find is it's contracting. So to build a home, it actually takes more resources today than it would have taken 10 years ago. And so that's the disturbing aspect. Some of that is being related to the regulatory environment, the difference in standards and fees and permitting, so there's definitely a factor there. And the other factors that are being attributed to is in the residential sector. It's largely a small company game, which means they often have 50 employees or less. And from that perspective, they're going to be slower to adopt innovation, and there's a very high reliance on doing things the same old way, manual processes.
One innovation that could help break that pattern is what Lindbäcks is doing in Sweden, building homes in factories instead of on site. And while modular housing production does exist in the United States, it still makes up only about 3% of new single-family home construction.
So to what extent is modular housing, prefab housing, a solution to productivity challenges in the housing sector?
Yeah, it's been cited as having some clear advantages and potentially lowering the cost of housing by 20 to 30%.
That productivity advantage shows up most clearly in multifamily housing, Lynn Beck's specialty.
It's pretty much like if you go to automotive industry. You see machinery, you see people, you see processes, and you see computers and robotics and material and so on. So we produce housing very like other organization produces cars. We do it indoors, year-round, 8 hours per day.
If I'm a potential client of yours, what are the financial benefits of buying a home from you rather than having someone build my building on site?
The first thing is cost for money. With our process, you pay very late in the process, so the interest cost is lower. Traditional build, you pay for the foundation, you pay for the structure, you pay for the roof, and blah blah blah. So you end up with having quite high cost for the interest, and you pay very late with our method. The second thing is the engagement as a customer in the process. You don't need to supervise a car manufacturing. You don't need to supervise a housing done in a factory.
For all the cost advantages that come with manufactured housing, it has also met with resistance. Something I myself encountered when advocating for its use while serving in the Canadian government.
One of the policies the Prime Minister campaigned on was building modular housing. That is a way to get more homes built faster. I've had people heckling me in the House of Commons in Canada saying, oh, you want everyone to live in a trailer park.
No.
Is there sort of a stigma about prefab housing?
I think so. And there's like some factors like, you know, prefab, you need wood frames, for example. And so some people would be, oh, well, the quality of the construction isn't as good. Or, you know, I want to put my personal stamp on it, which you can in prefab, especially with 3D printing and other factors in terms of technology. It's not like it was 10, 15 years ago. So part of it is the stigma. And part of it is making sure you have the right skills to do this, right? To make these design changes and to do it in an economical way so that people don't feel like it's all a cookie cutter factor coming through, right? So, you know, it's breaking through that mentality of what prefab meant.
It's not just buyer resistance that can be a challenge for manufactured housing. It's also the need for steady demand in an industry that is notoriously cyclical.
We try to maneuver to have a backlog that is about 1 year. We can be 1 year ahead of what's happening. And 1 year is, for us, it's a good time to have the backlog that long, but you need to take in consideration customers who has to wait for 1 year before we can hand over the next project. And if we see market going down, we need to address other kind of products so we can fill the production flow with projects.
And then there's the issue of regulation, something not unique to North America when it comes to home building. Elisabeth Svantesson is finance minister of Sweden.
Everywhere you go, certainly in the Western industrialized world, housing, especially the ability of young people to afford a home, is a pressing political issue. It's something you and I talked about as finance ministers.
Yeah.
How big an issue is it here in Sweden?
It's a big issue, especially in bigger cities. Many young people feel they don't really can afford to move quite early, but it's difficult to afford it because the prices have risen so much. One of the largest problem in the housing market is it is over-regulated. So rules, added new rules all the time, and that makes it difficult and very expensive to build.
Tell me a little bit about what you've done on cutting red tape.
Many rules have been added, and probably good purpose for every rule, but all the rules makes it very expensive to build. So that's why we are really trying to do, like now you can build like a Swedish house, a small house, and it's not so regulated at all. It's small, but you can live 1 or 2 in the house, so you can come in, so you can have your own home.
And governments aren't alone in grappling with how to build more and build faster. Wall Street is too. It's increasingly seeing affordable housing as both a need and an opportunity.
JP Morgan plays a really big role in affordable housing. It is part of our mission. Just to give you some statistics, I think in 2025, we lent and invested $10 billion towards the new construction or preservation of about 60,000 units nationwide.
Sharmi Saban leads community development banking at JP Morgan, overseeing investments aimed at scaling affordable housing solutions. And increasingly, that includes modular construction.
Time is money when it comes to construction. It costs money to build, it costs money to carry a loan, and if there's ways to make it shorter, you're going to save money. And when something is cheaper to build, it's going to be more affordable for the person that is ultimately renting or going to own the building. I mean, with modular housing, for example, units are built in weeks. They're put online in months. I think when you're doing ground up bricks and mortar, it takes months or years to get a building online, depending on where you are.
But the cost of building or manufacturing housing is only one part of what goes into making a home affordable, or not.
They're all linked. The cost is one piece, the interest rates are one piece, the regulations, the local zoning codes, if you're allowed to build multifamily here versus just single family, all of that leads to the constraints. I think what is great right now is that there is a lot more focus on this at the federal level and at the state level. I know they're looking more closely at how to ease some of those supply constraints and look at it more streamlining of creating a national building code, building a code for modular housing to help chip away again at some of these challenges that make it harder to bring units online.
Modular construction could reshape parts of the industry. But even its most vocal advocates caution against viewing it as a silver bullet. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, do you think most homes are going to be built in factories?
No.
Should they be?
No. I don't think so. Maybe 50 to go 100%, I think we would lose so much of the building organization skills. And I think we need to see in different products, different way of producing things. We need the challenge to be better. If everybody would do the same, where would the challenge be then?
Modular construction may never fully replace building houses one at a time on site, traditional building. But few major industries have changed so little over the past half-century. While manufacturing, logistics, even farming have reaped enormous productivity gains from automation and technology, home building largely hasn't. In a moment defined by shortages and a lack of affordability, the debate may be less about finding a perfect solution and more about whether an industry under this much pressure can afford to keep building the way it always has.
Next, how Sweden took the lead in manufactured housing. Along with Japan, Sweden is the country most committed to manufactured housing. How did that come about? And how have they overcome the stigma prefab housing has in other parts of the world? Our special correspondent, Krista Freeland, brings us the story.
Stefan, tell me, what are people building here?
At this station, they are building floor panels. So we build the floor with glue lamp, and we add on different material.
It's like Lego.
Yeah.
Lindbeck is a family company. You've been around for more than 100 years.
Yeah.
When did you start building modular homes, and how come?
We started in 1994. It was due to a big recession in Sweden. And the market, we did traditional building with on-site casting and also with some planar elements. And the market disappeared. We went from 100 to 25 employees within a half year, and we were going down the drain. And the upside comes from the European Union when we entered and did the change in building codes. So that was the opportunity for us. So we developed a method of using the element production we had and assemble them to a unit or a module and transport that to a building site that is further away than our normal market is. So we can move in the building sites in the factory. And by doing that in 1994, we trained ourselves and learned that it works.
And it's striking the way you describe it, that you build a house the way we build a car. Because construction is one industry that has not generally enjoyed the productivity improvements that we've seen in other sectors.
Mm-hmm. I can agree.
And why is that?
It's a tricky question. The short answer is the building industry doesn't have to. People tend to pay for whatever is produced at whatever cost there is. And when the cost is too high, people don't buy it. Then the market waits and waits, and after a while the demand is too high, so somebody starts to pay, and then the business starts rolling again.
How much more productive and efficient do you think your way of building a home is compared to a traditional on-site technique?
I would say the primary thing is to have shorter building time. The time on site compared to a traditional building is about half. So we cut the time on the building site with 50%. That is one thing. Another thing is how to work with, since we have wood as a structure material, we can work with carbon footprint to make it as low as possible. And today we have about half the footprint as the traditional way of building has. And then regarding cost efficiency, we try to operate so the time people need to work with the material is so short as possible.
What is the fastest you've gone?
We have had the fastest we have done here in the factory a capacity of 75 units per week. That equals to about a takt time of 30 minutes. That means every 30 minutes we have one unit out. And we had that for a couple of months. But now we go half of that because the demand isn't bigger than that.
And how long does it take to assemble those units when they get to the site?
On the building site, we assembly about 20 units per day. So we assembly 2 days per week. And then we end up the assembly with putting the roof on and covering up so we can get off the climate for weather. So 2 days a week, 20 units per day.
Labor shortages and lack of skilled labor are often a constraint in the construction industry. Mm-hmm. Is that a problem for you?
It can be a problem to find a spearhead of skill, but we try to design the processes and the methods so you can come quite unskilled to start. But after a short while, you have climbed a stair of knowledge. So within a couple of years, you are fully skilled to do almost every labor in the factory. So since we have so short takt times, people need to train. It's also a copy from the automotive industry, but they have 30 seconds of takt time, and the shortest we have is about 7 minutes. So in 7 minutes, you need to train what can be done in 7 minutes. If you have a takt time of 30 minutes, you need to train everything that should be done in 30 minutes. So it's trickier to have long takt time. It's easier to go with fast. And when we go fast, you can drive out much of the deviations, so we can find a root cause for improvement, and that speed is very, very important.
Is there any stigma for people around buying a modular home? Do people feel that it's not as...
A shed?
Yeah, as fancy as something?
Yeah. In Sweden, it's not as stigmatized as in the US. I know that. And we try not to focus so much about factory production. We focus on sustainable building built on the smart way. So that is our focus. And from what I know, when I've learned a lot of attention has gone manufactured homes are cheap, built, and ugly, people tend to think. But if you do the comparison to a car, you would never buy a car made in a parking lot because the quality would be gruesome. And you need to be in the factory, from our point of view, in order to maintain high quality and to lower the costs. So it has to do, I mean, we don't produce cheap housing. We produce housing with, it's quite expensive. And I don't think we should deliver cheap housing because they won't work longer than maybe 10 years. I mean, we are building things that should be standing for 50 or 100 years. To buy the cheapest thing to maintain a lifetime of up to 100 years, I don't think that makes a good, and it doesn't function. So you need to build in a more robust and sustainable way, and therefore it must cost a little, but sometimes the prices are ridiculous. So we have a business here to do.
So do you think we should actually turn our mindset upside down, that a factory-built home is actually going to be higher quality?
Yes, of course, it is. It is high quality. I know that, since we have when we do the final inspection, we have the same people do the final inspection on the building site, independently how the housing is done. And when we see the test results on the final inspection, we see that there are more quality issues when traditional built because they don't work with continuous improvement on a yearly day basis. We do that all the time. We have very good methods to find the proper way to work.
That does it for us here at Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. See you next week for more stories of capitalism.